You can go off. Hi, welcome back. CTAF members, you yourselves, if you want, you can go off camera. It just makes it a little bit easier for me to focus on the faces, at least, of the folks on the policy roundtable. But do feel free to chime in if you'd like to, as we have the conversation coming over the next, the next hour and 15 minutes. So I'm going to introduce a few new folks, but the goal again of the policy roundtable is to follow on to the conversation from this morning and really focus forward, to really think about what we're going to do about making sure that the access to these treatments reflects our goals for health equity, about what we're going to do to address the information needs of patients and clinicians, how we're going to apply the evidence to coverage policy from insurance companies, and in some way weave it into a payment approach that may try to track outcomes. We'll talk a lot about that. So first, let's go to the next slide and just introduce all the members of the Policy Roundtable. Many of these are folks who've been with us all day so far, but just again, why don't you all just reintroduce yourselves if you don't mind. So Debbie, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Debbie Benson Kennedy. I am Vice President of Medical Affairs at CSL Behring. I am also a hematologist and have been involved in research in designing hemophilia studies and taken this trend-based program through its biologics.
Debbie, I'm having a little bit of trouble hearing you very clearly, so just if you can just make sure that your voice is aligned well with your laptop or whatever microphone system you've got. It was coming through a little sketchy.
How is this now?
A little bit better.
I'll work on my controls.
Okay. Chuck, please introduce yourself.
Yeah, I'm Chuck Buckley with BioMarin. I'm the SVP of Commercial Operations for the United States, and I'm very happy to be here.
Thank you for joining us. Miguel, I know everybody knows you by now, but please just briefly introduce yourself again.
Yeah, Miguel Escobar, hematologist from the University of Texas and the Hemophilia Center as well.
Okay, thanks. Leslie.
Hi, I'm Leslie Fish. I work for a company called IPD, which we do strategy in pharmacy. I think since we haven't told you, we have not yet, the newer members here, I have no disclosures, no conflicts of interest. Thank you.
Thanks, Leslie. And again, for those new to this ICER meeting, IPD Analytics is not a payer itself, but through its work, it canvasses information from across the world of payers in the US. And so it's a great source for everybody to understand what's happening, and they do a lot of forecasting as well. So thank you again for joining us, Leslie. Brian, well known to most folks, just briefly introduce again.
Sure. Brian O'Mahony, CEO of the Irish Hemophilia Society. I have severe hemophilia B, and I am currently participating in a gene therapy clinical trial.
Thanks. Maggie?
I'm a professor of medicine and the Hemophilia Center director at the University of Pittsburgh, and I've done many clinical gene therapy trials, lots of patients. Thanks.
Michael, welcome.
Hi, thank you for inviting me. Michael Sherman, I'm Chief Medical Officer of Point 32 Health, which is a payer. And for those who have not heard of us, which I'm sure is just about everyone, Point 32 Health is a corporate name for the combined Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare and Tufts Health plans, which serve about 2.2 million members in 5 states and serve Medicare, Medicaid, and commercial.
Thank you. And Michael, I'm sure you're still guessing. How many years will it be before you don't have to say all that? I'm wondering. I'm sure you're thinking.
Given my age, for me, never.
All right, and Mark.
Mark Skinner. I live with severe hemophilia A. Long involvement in the hemophilia community. Most of my work is focused in patient outcomes, and a lot of it in the gene therapy space.
All right. So I have a little kind of cheat sheet of things I'm going to run through. We'll get to coverage in a minute, but I actually just want to stop, as I did at the very beginning of the meeting, in a sense, and I said it in general terms then, but I just want to acknowledge, as a former primary care doctor, I guess, I'm still just stunned by the innovation that we're witnessing with the cell and gene therapies coming through. And in hemophilia, what's in the pipeline, what's already available, what's coming soon. Mark or Brian, or Maggie or Miguel, what's this feel like? Is it as breathtaking for you all as I'm assuming?
It's
It is
exciting.
breathtaking.
Go ahead.
Yes, it is breathtaking. I mean, Mike Macros talks about the paradox of choice. If you have 3 cars to choose from, it's an easy choice. If you have 30 cars to choose from, it becomes more difficult. We've been in a fantastic space in the last 5 or 6 years in hemophilia. We've seen more innovation in the last 5 or 6 than the previous 20. And I think the next 5 or 6 might just make the last 5 or 6 look slow.
And the other part of the excitement is what we're learning about the coagulation pathway that we could have never known without doing these incremental changes. It's just exciting. The science is very exciting.
All right, well, congratulations for all of that. And we'll be talking about the cost issues and still a lot of the uncertainties as well, but there's just no doubt that we're starting from a platform of being pretty excited about what we're seeing conceptually, scientifically, and really what it means for patients potentially in the near term. So how are we going to get this right? I have a couple of things. Actually, Will Hubbard, if you remember his public comment, one of the things he said was, and perhaps born out of the healthy skepticism of the hemophilia patient community, we need somebody to make sure that patients and doctors get updated information, that there's a learning kind of environment here, and that, you know, because these are huge decisions, these one-time treatments that can really change the pathway that you're on for the rest of your life. How do we get that part right? Does the hemophilia community already have this set up so that you think it's going to be smooth? Do patients know where to go to get information, doctors? Or are there certain new things that are going to be needed, guidelines or other things from specialty societies? What might we focus on that could be improved, if anything? Brian?
This is well advanced. Some examples: the World Federation of Hemophilia are just rolling out a shared decision-making tool, which is going to be very detailed. The European Hemophilia Consortium for the last 4 years have organized a publication twice a year on novel therapies, which gives a detailed breakdown on all the clinical trials and all the data twice per year. And that's made available not just to patient organizations, but to clinicians. You look at WFH, NHF, EHC, Canadian Society, the Irish Society, everybody is putting out information on this. We also collaborate with each other. We try not to reinvent wheels. Many of us here, many of the patients on this call have been involved in several publications on this. So the patient organizations are very proactive on this. And we're also, I think, very committed to working collaboratively with the doctors to make sure that with these novel therapies, patients are not getting mixed messages.
Okay, that's great. Maggie?
2 things. I think there's a really, really incredibly excellent effort at the education session and how each center will prepare and be ready if they're going to do it. But the other thing that I think, number 2, has to do with the long-term follow-up. So for the companies that were early on, they're doing all the long-term follow-up. But Athen, which is an organization with registries, observational and prospective studies, is doing continuous follow-up of all those folks who've gotten gene therapy. And so I think we're going to have a robust set of data as time goes on.
I'm sorry, Maggie, what's the name of that organization?
American Thrombosis Hemostasis Network, Athen, ATHN. In the United States, there are many, many hemophilia centers. I'm sorry, I can't tell you if it's 120 or all 146 or what have you, but they are doing all sorts of prospective studies in many areas of hemophilia, not the least of which is chronic long-term gene therapy. So that question came up before. It's being done now.
Okay, that's great. Mark.
Yeah, so echoing the previous comments, I think just one of the features that's unique about hemophilia is the community itself. Sort of unlike a lot of the rare disease organizations, because of what happened in the 80s and 90s, we came together as a community and are globally networked in a way probably no other rare disease is. And we're have really robust education programs. So we've been working collaboratively on the issues that Brian identified as related to the registry, sort of the clinical challenges, the new data points, And that includes collaboration with companies and the manufacturers, as well as the FDA and EMA have been participating in these discussions to help guide it. It doesn't mean there aren't going to be changes and new issues, but I think we've done a pretty good job cataloging them and working through the changes that have to happen. There will be changes in reimbursement and how patients are managed with centers of excellence models and sort of the data collection, the need for patients to be more engaged in the longitudinal follow-up. And we've probably missed some issues, but I think we've pretty well cataloged them, and it will change the way care is delivered, but most likely in a good way.
Okay, great. Thanks. Debbie.
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to make just a couple comments. And Maggie, thank you for speaking about Athens, because I think that is a registry that's evolved unbelievably so over the last couple of years, and its maturity and how it manages data. But it stems from CDC activities and very collaborative research that's been going on and following patients for decades now. I think that there were some comments in the earlier discussion points about how maybe this won't happen, or maybe they won't follow up. But this community has been followed for an extended period of time, has worked closely with the pharmaceutical industry and the hemophilia treatment centers in a very organized and coordinated way. And our forefront efforts across, I think, the pharmaceutical industry, hemophilia treatment centers, and the patient community is tied to education, education, education. We've been waiting for gene therapy for 30 years. It's here. We're having success both in hemophilia A and hemophilia B, which is what we've been waiting for a long time. And I think all components are extremely committed to getting this right.
Okay, thank you. Miguel.
Yeah, I'm sure you're all quite familiar. About 80% or more of the patients in the U.S. get treated through the hemophilia treatment centers, right? And we're all in a big network. So the communication is amazing, and most of the education comes from our centers. Now, in addition to specifically gene therapy, the NHF has already applied for a REMS, for a risk evaluation and mitigation strategies, to be able to evaluate drug safety, right? Specifically for gene therapy, and that is critical. It's done here in the U.S. for many drugs that are quite similar. So there will be a very close follow-up.
Great. All right. So I knew some of this background, not all of it, but so 80, let's talk about the 80%, for instance. So 80% at the hemophilia treatment centers, 20% aren't. If I could say one thing about every single hemophilia patient I've heard either give a public comment or who's been involved in our report process or anything, you as a community are incredibly sophisticated in all ways. And I just wonder, are there people whose voices are not at the table? I mean, are there patients with hemophilia from lower socioeconomic groups who live outside of academic health center kind of network areas? Is there anything that yet needs to be done any differently to try to make sure that the equity of the access to these treatments can be improved to people who aren't already plugged in? Anything that you guys would identify as a best practice or an area that needs to be addressed? Maggie?
Well, the only thing I would mention is that the majority, to my knowledge, of hemophilia patients who are outside of the centers are not severe. If you have severe disease, you will not do well if you don't have an expert managing you. That doesn't explain things away. But the other issue is there may be isolated, designated centers where gene therapy would be done. The follow-up might be done at your HTC, but you're already being seen on an annual basis. So this is part of comprehensive hemophilia care as we practice it today.
Okay. Is there anything about patients who are covered by Medicaid that makes it more challenging for them to participate in these treatment centers? Does their experience merit any special note?
We cover them all. They all have access to factor in our center. I think that's true of many centers. We all have programs that help to do that. I'd be interested in others.
Okay, Miguel?
Yeah, I will say probably the only population, at least in our state, in Texas, is the population that do not have health coverage, right? We got a population, a lot of, for example, immigrants, certainly they do not have any coverage. And that is a population that unfortunately won't be able to probably get a drug like this right now.
Okay, yeah. Brian?
I think the other point about equity of access revolves around education, and we have to remember that the hemophilia community would include people with PhDs and people who didn't finish high school. So, and this is a complex scientific area. So we have to make the information not just comprehensive, but comprehensible. So we have to give the same information at several different levels of education and comprehension.
Yeah, I mean, I've helped develop some shared decision-making tools myself, and I know how hard it can be to do that for different levels, if you will, of health literacy and English ability, et cetera. So it sounds straightforward, but it's sometimes really difficult. Mark?
Yeah, so Brian, I think really hit the nail on the head. We are as different as hemophilia can be in terms of how it manifests in the community. So we certainly have the same health inequities and disparities of other rare disease groups. And that is part of why the patients and the clinicians in industry as well, I would add, are really working together to make sure that there's a common set of information. So wherever an individual patient feels comfortable going, they're going to get the same information and that it's networked. But we do risk populations being left behind because of lack of information or access. And it isn't just the patients, there's clinicians as well. There is a big void of information on the clinical side. There's only a handful of centers that really have been involved deeply in gene therapy. And so the clinicians are going to have to get comfortable before they're going to be comfortable suggesting their patients go to other centers. So it's going to be a journey.
Okay. All right. We may come back, if there's time, we may come back to equity, especially the international equity. I mean, it's hard enough sometimes to deal with the equity issues inside the US, but for anything that's priced at this level, there are going to be international equity issues that we could probably spend a whole nother meeting talking about. But I want to kind of start to pivot towards thinking about the coverage aspects, the insurance coverage, and then we'll round from that back into kind of payment mechanisms and that kind of thing. So I just want to reflect briefly on the Hemlibra experience, the emicizumab experience, because I think it will raise some questions for what may be coming for the gene therapies. And in some way, I know this because ICER, we have barriers to fair access program where we do analysis of payers' coverage to see if it matches certain evidence-based kind of criteria. And Hemlibra has been a really challenging area. And here's part of what happens. The clinical trial eligibility for Hemlibra from the, I want to say Haven 3. They had to have severe congenital hemophilia A. They had to have documented use of factor VIII treatment and a number of bleeding episodes in the last 6 months. So just remember those two things, severe as a word, and then they had to have factor VIII and bleeds. Then the FDA comes out with a label that says Hemlibra is indicated for routine prophylaxis to prevent or reduce the frequency of bleeding episodes for adults or pediatric patients with hemophilia A with or without factor inhibitors. No mention of whether they've had factor VIII before, no mention of anything else, no mention that it's severe. They don't use that word in the label. So now you've got a label that in a sense feels more expansive, potentially, and you've got health plans, some of which, but not all of which, use the clinical trial eligibility criteria to say, oh, you've got to have factor VIII used this much before you can qualify for emicizumab. Mark and Brian, you guys may be very familiar with these issues as if you work with American payers. But I want to focus, in a sense, on how that might affect things going forward. So what I'd like to do is just to walk through some of the clinical trial eligibility factors and query you guys on whether we think that they will or should be made part of the insurance coverage. I guess you can guess about whether they'll be made part of the FDA label as part of that. But with the idea that at least with Hemlibra, a lot of those, the severe part didn't come over into the label, nor did any kind of use of factor as part of a kind of qualification. So with that in mind, I'm just going to run a short list of things that are in every single insurance coverage policy. So age is probably not going to be an issue here because at least at the beginning are going to be for people who are 18 and over. That was the trials. And I think there's clinical experts back me up on this, but there are some concerns about the liver effects. I'm not sure if that's, I forget now, I'm not the expert on these, which of them has more of a liver effect than the other, but do you think there are going to be clinical experts who are going to have patients who are 16, 17, 15, even before there might be a label expansion? Is there any reason that a health plan should just flat out not accept kind of this idea for a patient who's under the age of 18?
Well, the issue has to do in under 18 to what we understand is the, hepatocyte cell division. If you get gene therapy and you have rapid cell division, you're going to lose that vector and that expression. So we really don't have that piece worked out. So at what age does the more rapid hepatocyte division happen, and when does it become more adult-like? So that's a good reason not to do it, at least not till we know more.
Okay, I think that's helpful for everybody, because the FDA obviously is likely to say 18 and over, but there's a real clinical reason why we wouldn't assume that it should be just as good, or the risks and benefit balance would be the same for younger patients. Michael?
Yeah. So first of all, start with the science, and I'll defer to those who have more expertise than me. There's another big piece here, and that has to do with something that insurance companies call adverse selection. And we saw a little bit of this with Zolgensma. So I'd say there's a couple of questions here, which is broadly for anything. Do you think it's fair value for what is being put out? In other words, are you inclined to make it harder to get than you need to because you think you're getting ripped off? And then the second question is, what is everyone else doing? So when you have a situation where the answer to the first is yes, we think we're getting ripped off, and we, and again, understand that you're not paying for these by and large for commercial insurance and most other kinds of insurance, because the out-of-pocket maximums are so small, they're inconsequential. Everyone's paying it for. So we're really worried about health insurance affordability and the impact on premiums and the extent to which people say, I can't afford insurance. So that just to be clear on why it's an issue. But the problem is that if you are a health plan and you go for the more expansive criteria, let's say FDA label, and others are not, you're putting a giant sign up saying, if you're 16, 17, or whatever the situation is, come buy our policy on the exchange. If you don't have access to it through your employer, pay us a few $1,000s and use a $2.5–4 million, whatever cost gene therapy is. So that's not actually a good model if you'd like to be a going concern. And so for these super high priced therapeutics, there is some pressure based on our financing system to not be an outlier.
Yeah, understood. Thanks, Chuck.
I'd also say that we anticipate a label that's going to be very close to, if not exactly, what our inclusion exclusion criteria are for the clinical trial. And to Maggie's point, I think you would need to show we're going to need to do life cycle management trials to actually do the clinical trial in order to expand the label. That's their expectation. I don't, particularly the other products, and you can see, creep in a label. This one, if it's going to happen, it'll be a lot slower, my guess is, than it would with additional pharmaceutical.
Because of the price.
Because of the price, and also I think the science. I think you want to understand if you're going to give it to a 16-year-old, what does that mean with the liver turnover? If you're going to give it to somebody with an inhibitor, previous inhibitors, you want to understand what are the ramifications.
Got it. Thanks, Leslie.
What I actually just want to say is that a clarification, Stephen, is that I heard earlier today, and I think that 50% of hemophilia A is in the Hemlibra, and it may not have started like that, and you may have had prior authorizations, et cetera, but obviously there's a lot of patients who didn't get it. And so I sort of just wanted to, I think you have a list of other risks and what the PAs, et cetera, step therapies. But, we always had the statement that good drugs rise to the top and bad drugs go away. And I'm so glad that everybody here is saying that it's going to be people are going to think about this. They're going to think about it. They're really going to look at it. And then we will probably see being trends, which needs to be done because there's so many unknowns on it. So.
Great, thank you. Debbie.
Yeah, I would like to echo about the inclusion criteria for eligibility and an alignment with the community, both the patient community and the clinical community, of what really looks like the most appropriate patient for gene therapy. I don't think that there's a great appetite across all parties to reach beyond with something that we know is so innovative, and we want to make sure it's done well, and we have flawless success for patients in that perspective. So one of the challenges, and I don't think that this came up earlier, is when you design trials for hemophilia, we don't have the luxury of numbers, as Maggie said. But also, one of the things is that we can use the patients as their own control, which is what's been done in the gene therapy. You don't randomize, but you follow the patients and how they were and control their experience and then cross them over into treatment. So there is robustness of the designs, but there's also very clear criteria to define for patients that need factor replacement therapy, what looks like severe, what looks like a severe phenotype. So these are categorized. And the studies are designed so we can have generalizable elements for factor replacement therapy, but much more contained exposure in the gene therapy space. So there's a lot of pieces, I think, that come into play that control this. And I think all of the sponsors of all the different programs are really in a very similar path.
I hear what you're saying. I'll just note that I have seen situations in which companies do want the utilization of their drug to fall slightly outside the boundaries of what their clinical trial eligibility were, and many patient groups end up feeling like they're too constrained by those as well. And I'll come back to it because, again, we can all guess about whether the FDA will use the word severe in the label. If so, that will really open the door to different ways to define that. And obviously the clinical trial eligibility is one way, but we'll come to the question of whether factor VIII replacement, for instance, should be necessary prior to consideration of a gene therapy in a moment. I see 3 more hands, and so let me go quickly through those. And then I want to dive into that question in particular about factor VIII prior to a gene therapy, especially for younger patients. 18 or over still. Maggie.
So just one small point, and that is that when we say severe, clinically, we're thinking about severe. So while it's defined as less than 1%, we have patients who have 1, even up to 2%, who have very frequent bleeds, use lots of clotting factors. So the trouble is, by relaxing that, you're opening up way wide to interpretation, as you just said. So I just wanted to be sure that that issue came out. Yep.
All right, thanks, Brian.
I think, unlike other therapies, you're not going to see indication creep with hemophilia gene therapy. I think the patient organizations and the clinicians will be united in trying to make sure as much as possible that the clinical trial and licensing requirements are stuck with or kept to it. And in fact, we may well start education for 16-year-olds on gene therapy, but it'll be very clear that there's no possibility of them being considered until they're at least 18. We'd be very much opposed to that otherwise.
Okay, thank you, Mark.
Yeah, so not a lot to add, just to remind the group, Nathan Schaefer mentioned it in the comments from the patient organizations. In the community letter to FDA requesting the REMS, the request was to adhere to the trial eligibility requirements for the label. We're very mindful of this as opposed to other conditions. And so putting this within a REMS environment actually provides some of the protections for the concerns that I think are embedded in the question.
Okay, so let me just run quickly then. I assume we're going to have just a bunch of nodding heads. So the trial inclusion criteria for Valrox, hemophilia A with residual factor levels less than 1. No concern about that being the insurance coverage requirement. Agreed? If some people don't agree, let me know. So
Sorry, I will have to disagree partially on that because, again, like Maggie mentioned, if you go severe by the numbers are less than 1%, but I prefer to call them severe phenotypes. And that could be 1 or 2, doesn't matter, but it is a specific patient that has a certain type of bleeding. And that I think it will be more accurate. And I think even the World Federation is moving more towards that kind of nomination of severe phenotype than by just giving a number.
Okay, so now we have a little bit of a conflict because we just heard that patient community wants those clinical trial eligibility. Everybody's assuming they will, so we're going to get stuck with one or less, at least for the short term.
I don't think
Mark?
there's a disagreement with what Miguel said. I think the community is moving to the recognition that severe is more than just a number, that moderate patients at the severe end of moderate can bleed like severes. So in time, I think that may be where we go. So the question, as I interpreted it, is, how should this all begin and what's required to expand? And I do think the criteria were slightly different in the way they were phrased in Heme A and Heme B. There are, I think it was the Heme B trial, there was somebody who was in the sort of the moderate range, but bled phenotypically in the severe range. So I think we already have examples of where that's come into the trials, but Debbie can correct me if I misstated that.
No, that's correct, Mark. And that's because of the population, the number of patients. All of the hemophilia B trials for drug development have a higher factor percentage to make sure that they can be adequately represented in the clinical studies. But the requirement of having a severe phenotype, i.e. being prescribed prophylaxis, is sort of the control point from that perspective. These are not patients that only need factor 2 times a year. This is not the candidate patient for gene therapy.
So let me come back to that too, because I know that's been a bone of contention with some of the insurance coverage policies. Okay, but for hemophilia A, Michael or Leslie, you can comment, but if the clinical trial eligibility say they had to be 1 or lower on factor, my understanding is that would be exactly what they would put in the insurance coverage policy. They're not going to have a phenotypic determination.
Yeah,
Correct.
it's highly unlikely we would be broader than that under any circumstance, I can imagine. Again, I think I don't want to go, and I don't want to go off track here, but I have a perspective that I would like to see the pharma companies giving us solutions versus drugs, and we can talk about what that means. So I think there are ways we can talk about that more broadly, but in the confines of a traditional paying for a drug or a gene therapy or what have you, probably not.
And just let me add that, remember that these type of step therapies management are dynamic. Just because they begin may be more strict. As it goes on and you have more information coming out, and it sounds like almost everybody's that's been on the panel so far has suggested this, the more information, the better, and those can change very much.
All right, we're going to talk about step therapy, and I know we'll have fun with that one too. All right, so, and we don't have quite the same situation here as we did with Hemlibra, because there are questions of younger patients who might not have been on regular prophylaxis, who get to an age where they want to go to soccer camp. They've wanted to stay away from prophylaxis so that they don't get inhibitors. And maybe the doctor says, you should start Hemlibra. But the insurance company says, no, you've got to be on factor and have a high level of factor to show that you're not mild hemophilia, basically. So I know that there's clinical experts. Have you seen this with your younger patients? Have you had this experience with emicizumab? I've heard a few scattered stories, but I'm curious if you hear this or have experienced it. Yes.
Yes.
Okay. But we don't have that problem here because everybody's going to be 18. They're going to be on factor.
Perfect.
So it's not going to be a problem yet. Okay. Inhibitors. I don't think we have to talk about inhibitors. So let's go to the hemophilia B side. And Debbie, I just want to make sure I understood you, because I'm looking at the clinical trial eligibility criteria, and it might have been truncated, but I'm not seeing a factor, a residual factor level. It's labeled as severe or moderately severe, currently on prophylaxis. Was that the only eligibility criterion?
That was the key eligibility criteria. Once again, remember, these are inherited disorders. People don't go off their factor just to get a lab test. There's high variability in these lab tests. So one day 1%, one day 1.5%, depending on the temperature in the laboratory. So the reality is that patients that have had historical and the diagnosis of severe or moderately severe, that's usually about 2% factor activity, have severe bleeding phenotypes and on prophylaxis. So when it comes to the cost offset part, it's going to be patients that are consuming a lot of factor because that's their prescription and that's what they need to manage their bleeds. So that's the piece. What would be, I think, terrible is if there was an expectation to go back in to say you must prove with your lifelong disorder, prove you have severe or moderately severe hemophilia, because the standard of care is to be on factor replacement therapy. And sometimes the burden of just the medical records, can be quite challenging for individuals. So I think that there isn't a doubt in the hematologist's mind of their patients that are being treated with prophylaxis meet the appropriate criteria.
Are there patients who fall into a gray zone? Again, in my discussion with some payers, they're really eager to figure out how to identify a milder phenotype that does not qualify for Hemlibra, for instance. And they say there's some patients who just, they get it once a year before they go to summer camp, or they get it, and we don't want them to jump onto emicizumab. So they want some threshold for factor use. And we've all been saying routine prophylaxis like we know what that exactly means, but I'm assuming there's a bell curve in which some patients use it somewhere in the gray zone. They're not on it regularly every single month, but clinical experts, is there a way to define reasonably what a milder phenotype looks here for hemophilia B, since we're not going to be using factor levels to define it according at least to the clinical trial eligibility criteria?
You can always use number of bleeds per month, or annualized bleed rate, but I think it's really important to recognize some people do fewer activities when they know they're going to have bleeds, and it means they have to take more factor. So unfortunately, unless there's a way to define that, that you've played soccer 5 times a week or whatever it is and had no bleeds, and that means you're mild, but people can't live up to their full potential to do things when they are either unwilling to take factor, or they know they're going to have a bleed because of the way the factor works for them. So it's difficult.
So if an insurer called you and said, Maggie and Miguel, I can help you too. Help me. What's the best way I can use existing evidence? I guess I can always ask the clinician to attest, yes, they're severe, whatever that means. But this is a $4 million drug. I want something that I can apply quantitatively, consistently. Is there a way to do that so that what do you think?
I would think a number of bleeds or amount of factor used. I think there's probably a way that people could agree on that, but will they? That's really the issue. I don't know.
But is there a clinical guideline defined threshold for amount of factor used to define?
Many trials have done that, and I don't remember all the little details, but they clearly, you go through the inclusion exclusion, immediately whether your patient for this particular drug is going to qualify. For most of us, we know if you have more than 3 or 4 spontaneous bleeds a month, or every few months, that they're severe. But I don't want to give the definition because I don't think we have one.
Okay. Tricky. And I'll ask the insurers how they, as they hear this, how they think some plans will try to come up with an approach to this mild issue for hemophilia B. Mark?
Yeah, and so just a little bit of a comment, and I think, to Dr. Ragney's comment, and all due respect, bleeding and the number of bleeds is a very imperfect metric. It is, in fact, a patient-reported outcome. It is, if I don't report a bleed or perceive that I've had a bleed, it doesn't get reported in the data. And there's no way for that to be recorded more empirically. Factor activity level has been our preferred metric over recent years, and what we've thought is the best indicator. To ask a patient to have to bleed their way to access to treatment is really, at least unconscionable from the patient perspective. We know that every bleed matters, that joint disease begins with the first set of joint bleeding. So to say that I have to have gone through a series of bleeds, particularly when I've had a history, or, my phenotype and my bleeding is well known, just doesn't seem to make sense. And it really seems inappropriate in this scenario. So the step therapy and having to bleed your way to access doesn't make a lot of sense. I could certainly recount for you my annual trials and tribulations of trying to get coverage each year, where they ask me to document my bleeding history from 3 years ago before I switched to emicizumab. They said, well, you didn't bleed last year, so you don't need emicizumab. And I had to go back and pull my bleed records from 3 years ago before I switched. I mean, we're going to be in that same scenario. It's just using bleeds is an imperfect metric.
So Mark, if it is, what is the amount of factor that a health plan should use to, if that's the other option, to define moderately severe to severe as opposed to mild?
So I actually did like the way Debbie described it. So the moderately severe, there are those at the severe end of the moderate range, sort of in that 2% range, which is just over the threshold, could be the day of laboratory work that I think are equally meritorious. Maybe in time, the less severe moderates and the milds, will become the new severe population. But initially, anybody that is severe or bleeding like a severe patient, to me, is a reasonable candidate.
Okay, we've got lots of hands, so let me run the list here. Miguel.
Yeah, I think that, we cannot take one variable only to make a decision if that patient is certainly considered severe or not. I think that something that we forget in our adults is joint disease. The moment I see one of my patients that has joint disease, to me, that patient I consider to be a severe. And that is a large number of our adult population, right? So I think that has to be taken in consideration as well, because and certainly the records, but it's hard to, a patient has been in prophylaxis for the last, 10, 15 years, he might not bleed much. But if he has multiple joints that are affected, that to me is enough to say that patient has severe disease. And there is also a classification from the ISTH in regards to what is a constant prophylaxis or not, continuous prophylaxis too, if they want to use that as well.
Yeah. I apologize, I'm having a little bit of internet issues here. I hope you can hear me okay. Yes, all right. Let's go ahead, Debbie.
Yeah, I think that, it's often thought that, you have to have people just failing, and it's not the goal. For diabetics, we don't ask them to go into DKA to get a new insulin. This is replacement therapy. These patients are deficient of a critical protein that when it's not there, it's life-threatening. So prophylaxis is the standard. It is expensive, that's true, but those patients are severe. And even if they're not bleeding on prophylaxis, their disease hasn't changed. So I think that it's sometimes these abstract conversations about a rare disease, or people don't understand what that clinical picture looks like if you haven't treated those patients. But what we ask these patients to do, if you equated that to diabetes, would be to go into DKA if you're trying to ask them to have bleeds to be eligible for something. And I think that maybe that for all of the internal medicine colleagues that are on this call that are not hematologists, maybe that resonates with you a little bit more.
Yeah, I was going to say I'm back to what Miguel said. Obviously, we would think of patients as individuals with different ways to be severe. The challenge for a health plan is that I think they have a reasonable argument to say that we want to not cover this $4 million treatment for people with mild hemophilia. And now we're just arguing about what that means and how you can put it into a program that will either ask for information or probe an electronic record and figure it out in a consistent way. There's always going to be an exceptions process, but someone's going to have to figure this out, because I know every single payer, and maybe Michael's going to comment on this, but every single payer is going to want to have some line in the sand that defines mild versus moderately severe to severe, so that there will be some criteria before they get coverage for a $4 million drug. Brian?
Yeah, I think really we have to look at individual life goals and activities, and like PK-based prophylaxis stopped the long-standing practice of where people bled their way to better treatment. So, they eventually found the prophylaxis regime that worked for you, but having said that, you destroyed 2 joints on the way. So I've no doubt that people will go through various therapies before getting the gene therapy in many cases. But I don't think that should be a given. That should not be a requirement. And I'll give you an example. We had a conference last month We had two families there talking about their children, and one adult talking about their experience. And you had one young man who was very, very active. He's on daily prophylaxis for the standard half-life factor. He's actually playing Irish hurling, which is like American football without the padding. His brother was on an extended half-life factor. He's very active, and he needs the peaks, but he's not quite as active as his brother who takes daily prophylaxis. A third person was emicizumab. He's doing extremely well with a constant level of 10 to 15%. He doesn't need the same peaks. So I think, but it would be entirely wrong to say you have to go through A to get to B, to get to C, to get to potentially look at gene therapy. Step therapy might be a reasonable requirement in some cases, but it shouldn't be a requirement. And I think also in terms of when you look at outcome-based payment model, for example, I think one of the things that could be looked at is the cost offset in terms of the decrease for the individual in their current use of factor or emicizumab.
Yeah, although I don't know, yes, and I still somehow am just, it makes me uncomfortable to think that we would consider you severe if you're expensive enough that this treatment would be cost saving. Just, it sounds so non-clinical, even if it's a part of
that's what step therapy might cause.
But in a sense, it makes clinical sense because you're more expensive because you are severe and you're needing a lot of factor. That is one way to define it. If you cost us more than $600,000 a year, you can get access to the gene therapy. That would be one way that they could do it. Anyway, park that idea aside and we'll move on. Michael?
Yes. So, I'm thinking about this as I'm hearing it in the context of risk benefit. Think about efficacy and safety. So the reason I kind of like parts of that DKA example, but there was one thing that was not tracking to me. So the fact is that if somebody is well controlled on an existing treatment, non-gene therapy, and they're doing well, that's a success. The problem is, and this has been a lot of the discussion, much of what ICER and others have published, we don't really know what's going to happen over the long term. And there are concerns about liver toxicity, hepatic carcinoma, et cetera. So there's an additional safety issue, and without really understanding the total efficacy picture, it isn't clear to me that I would even want that if I were the patient. And and there are some, and again, I won't speak for the patient community, but there's a number of KOLs who are saying they think the uptake may be slow until there's more experience. Again, as you said before, that the N on this is extraordinarily low.
Right. Exactly. Leslie, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm going to be very brief because I really had 4 comments as people continue to comment themselves. So one to the looking at it in the terms of sort of the diabetes model that was stated. And then you actually said this right away, Steve, that but in diabetes, you're not looking at $4 million a year. Yes, you're giving them insulin. It's expensive for those patients, but it's not $4 million. That's what, unfortunately, our healthcare is going to have to be looking at. But going back a little to sort of go backwards, that somebody here mentioned going back retrospectively and saying, yeah, I did have a lot of bleeds 3 years ago. That's not a big lift. It shouldn't be a big lift, even if you've changed health insurers, which we may get to. What happens when you do health change? But going back, most of these are, yes, I did bleed a lot, et cetera. That's not a heavy lift for $4 million a year. Maggie, I just had something to say because you mentioned 3 to 4 bleeds a month. I think every health insurer in the United States would think that was a hell of a lot of bleeds. So I don't think you're going to have any discussion. In fact, I sort of had started off with 1 bleed a month is going to put you into a far more severe, you don't want to see it. And finally, this is making me really nervous, Stephen, because if we do go into outcomes-based contracting, we're going to be having the same discussion about definitions of what those outcomes are going to be. Are they going to be bleeds? Are they going to be factor? What they're going to be? So it's making me a little nervous.
That's all right. Chuck is all ready to talk about that when I turn to him. He'll help us through that. Debbie, and then I want to keep going to get to step therapy, and then we can pivot a bit to the payment mechanisms. Go ahead, Debbie.
No, thanks. I use the DKA example because, well, in the end, there's more than 4 million people with diabetes and hemophilia B with the severe phenotype in the adult population. There'd be 600 total in the United States that could potentially truly be eligible. ICER said 800, it's close, it's probably less than that. So we're talking about a population that's defined themselves through their life. They have an inherited disorder. So 18 years of age, they've had a lot of experience with both factor, bleeding, and access, period. And that's why there's hemophilia treatment centers. So, you know, I completely acknowledge that there are many, many therapies out there in a variety of different places where there's creep. I would say we call it dose creep in hemophilia, because maybe they need more units than you would have expected based on their phenotype. But defining the patient population that has an interest in taking for some risk, being in that uncertain place, but recognizing that self-IV administration and sticking a needle in your arm and putting drug in is not what the average person is expected to do to manage their own healthcare. And, you know, those are all pieces that sometimes we forget to say out loud, but that burden is very different than sub-Q insulin. It's very different than other sub-Q drugs. It's self-IV administration on a regular basis is what factor 9 treatment looks like today.
All right. A couple other coverage elements I want to get to, and then we can start to talk about other aspects. One is the provider criteria. We heard a little bit about this earlier. Should insurance companies say that this treatment should only be provided at a hemophilia treatment center? Or does that raise our equity problems and other concerns? So let me start with the insurers. I'm not sure if you've heard about this or thought about it yourself. Maybe you already, I mean, emicizumab, I'm not sure if you restrict its use within a hemophilia treatment center or not, but with this treatment, $4 million one time, what do you think are the pros and cons of limiting it to hemophilia treatment centers?
Yeah, so Steve, first of all, we do not have that requirement for emicizumab, to your earlier point. You know, I think our feeling is that if something is that costly, you really don't want someone doing it again. This is not a common condition, kind of one every year or two. It suggests that they might make mistakes, which don't really benefit anyone. So, you know, our predisposition is toward requiring a treatment center or other appropriate specialist. Again, to your earlier point, you know, health equity is a real issue in some areas. So I think you either need an exception request or be willing to have a travel benefit or some way to make sure you provide that available. In other words, if we're going to require it, we need to make sure we can make it available.
Okay.
You know what, in Michael, I was thinking as you said that, because if the patient isn't near a treatment center, you said 20% of them, there are many insurers who have in their policies and contracts with patients that they will send them to the center that is need be. Again, I think we've talked about this follow-up, maybe with their normal hematologist, et cetera, wherever they may be. But the treatment, the actual treatment itself will probably be at a center. Again, did we talk about a REMS program on this one?
Yes.
Because the REMS program may say, you know, that may clarify, may or may not clarify if you would have to.
Yeah. The other thing that we heard is that to a certain extent, there's kind of a connection or correlation between already being in a treatment center and having severe phenotype. So most of this, at least the general sense, was that the severe patients have figured out how to get to, or maybe they've just moved because that's the only way they can really make life work. They are now already connected to a hemophilia treatment center. So it may not be a complete overlap in the Venn diagram, but there's some suggestion of that. Chuck and then Miguel.
I think he's on mute.
Yeah, he knows he is. He's just there.
I'm getting having mute problems. No, we actually, you know, one of the benefits of getting a complete response letter is you get the gift of time. And one of the gift of time that is we've had the last couple of years when we looked at a distribution model and how do you approach this is, you know, maybe realizing the obvious, but the medical home for patients, adult, you know, with severe hemophilia A is it's the HTC, it's the Hemophilia Treatment Center. And a subset of those HTCs and or their affiliated clinics will probably be the treatment home. And that's for us, as we look at the distribution, how this would play out is the, makes the most sense. So I do believe as you look at, gene therapy, especially it's a one-time shot, and if you mess it up, that's a big deal for the patients. It's you don't want to do that. I think having centers that do it more than once, what you do often, you do better, makes more sense to us. So we're looking at the HTCs as certainly the medical home, but a subset of those would be the treatment home with or without a REMS. I mean, the REMS that's an FDA decision, and for us, we've got one with another product. It's not hard for us to operationalize that. So we're a little bit, I say, agnostic towards that.
Okay, good. Thanks, Miguel.
Yeah, I think there's plenty of data to show that the HTCs is where the best care is for our patients. I mean, we cannot argue that. And in the clinical trials, pretty much all were done in HTCs, right? So we know exactly what we're doing. Now, as part of the REMS, yes, that is specific point of being given in an HTC is there. If the FDA will approve it or not is a different story, but that's been part of the REMS, definitely.
Okay. Debbie, I'm actually going to ask if I can ignore you for just this one time, because I just realized with 20 minutes left, I want to make sure we do have enough time to talk about some of the outcomes-based contracting aspects. And I wanted to get a real quick comment from you guys on step therapy. The one thing we heard was that at least, and Mark, you may or may not want to be clear about who this was, but at least one payer in the US is at least considering step therapy of emicizumab before you would receive Valrox. Is that just because the patient churn might suggest that it would be more cost effective for a payer to have a patient on emicizumab for a few years before they move on? What is the justification for emicizumab as a step to a gene therapy?
I don't know that it's my place to identify the insurer. I think it's public record, but I'll just hold out. It's one, I've seen it in one written policy, and it may be in others that I'm not aware. I don't understand the logic that if a patient is on prophylaxis and there is value or a need to optimize, or they have a desire to change their therapy to achieve a specific goal, I think that should be the decision between the patient and the clinician. We have not yet had clinical experience of patients moving from emicizumab to gene therapy or from gene therapy to emicizumab. It doesn't mean that it can't be done or would be contraindicated. We also don't have a clear definition of what treatment failure on emicizumab would be. So I think there's a variety of things that just really confound it and take the patient out of the center of the decision. So I think it really sticking with what's right for the patient and what they and their clinician decide seems, to me, the most appropriate one. And if we're going to end up in that place anyway, then it seems to me to be a lot of steps that don't make a lot of sense. So there are some scientific issues that would have to be worked through, some clinical issues. It doesn't mean they couldn't be done, but they have not been resolved yet.
Okay, Miguel?
Yeah, I think we had something similar when the long-acting products came and Hemlibra came out, right? That they wanted this kind of step-type treatment. And to me, that doesn't make any sense, because if they're being approved and they're standard of care, you can use whatever you want, right? You can start them with EMI, you can start them with factors standard. And so I think that there's really no rationale to be able to put that kind of policy where they have to have some sort of, step to be able to get to gene therapy. That doesn't make any sense.
Okay. All right. So thank you. I got that down. Now let's talk about pricing and payment. And the big fish here is around the idea of outcomes-based contracting that we'll talk a fair amount about, because there are some issues around how that could be operationalized that I think are really important to talk through. But Chuck, I've got a written description. I think it comes from material that your company has put out already. Do you want to just describe briefly what you're thinking of doing in the market with your program?
Right, we're looking at a warranty construct, meaning that if you have a suboptimal outcome, that would be akin to a product failure. The idea of the warranty then is it allows us to have total skin in the game, so that because as Michael knows, the payers have been asking for, their worry has been either variability of the upfront response and/or durability. So upfront response, if you'd have a patient that would fail, our goal would be to pay up to WAC to try to, be able to do so. Under warranty, we believe we can. If a patient, let's say it's a 4-year warranty, that's the time frame, and that's been one mostly bandied about. We haven't quite settled on it, but that's, it's probable to be a 4-year warranty. If a patient, with suboptimal failed at 2 years, then you would pay half of that. And that way the payer would have got at least a value of 2 years, and then they would have been compensated for the 2 years that they did not get for the warranty period. But the idea is to have skin in the game. The idea is to have obviously a third-party administrator taking care of it, so that we're not the ones adjudicating whether a patient is a suboptimal outcome or not. I will say that we believe that this is a contract between the manufacturer and the payer, an agreement between the manufacturer and the payer, and should not dictate what a physician and their patient determines their best course of therapy. So I know that is a worry from the patient side, and I get it. And but that's our goal and our intent is this is an agreement to manufacturer and payer, and should not impact the decision that a patient and an HCP makes about going back to prophy or to ME or whatever they feel is best for their patient and their lifestyle.
Okay, a couple quick questions. What happens if a patient changes insurers 2 years in?
So that's the portability is something we've not solved for, obviously.
Okay.
So that's which is why I avoided Steve. but
just a little issue.
But we do the portability though is just like this with hemophilia. We did a study, and most hemophilia A patients or hemophilia patients stay with their insurance programs from 4 to 5 years. So we believe portability, although is an issue, a little bit less the hemophilia population, but I will say it's an issue.
You know what, I'm going to ask you though, this is a disconnect that everybody's going to eventually have to connect. Because number one, I thought that it was really a 5-year contract. I thought I had read, but at year 4, if you actually have decrease in efficacy, then you get paid back 20%. So I think that's what I had read. You probably have changed it since that came out. That statement came out in September of this year. But the second thing about it is that I heard everybody today and all of the qualities, et cetera, of life, et cetera. But it looks like it's 8.5 years. Until you have some sort of payback or until it's the even level is, so that looking at that 4 to 5 year, I still think there's not totally a connect the dots here.
Yeah, and Leslie, the reason it was, and this will go back to years ago at MIT New Digs, were doing their pricing, precision pricing, or Duke Margolis. A lot of it is operationalizing it with the payer. Can you go beyond 4 years and truly believe that you can follow that patient and operationalize that? We don't really have a set. I said 4 years because that was the original back in 2020 prior to the CRL. That was our original intent. We haven't settled on a time frame. We're still working through that. But you're right. There's that's a consideration.
Yeah, and the very last thing, Stephen, we have to get into, and it's going to take too long, so you won't. But what the actual outcomes for that contract are they bleed?
Yes. No, we're going there real quickly. After Michael, that's where I'm going next. Chuck knows it's coming too. So go ahead, Michael.
Yes. So first, I'm not going to comment, unlike Leslie, on exact contracts, because I'm pretty sure that I'm under NDAs with both entities, and we are reviewing certain materials. So I'm going to be really general and conceptual for that reason. The nice thing about hemophilia is, in theory, there are measures which are objective, such as bleeds, amount of factor required, other treatment, hospitalization, et cetera. So there are metrics which are objective and which are not hard to collect. A second comment I would make is the question they're clearly operational. So, both companies have shown willingness to come to the table, but there are significant operational constraints, particularly as you go out further. There are ways around them, particularly for the fully insured population, such as, again, agreeing that the originating payer is on the other side of the agreement, even if they leave, whoever paid for it. I would also point out that with more and more employers self-insured with reinsurance, it adds another level of complexity that I don't think anyone's thought about. And then one other really important point here, I've read articles about how high housing prices are being enabled by 40 or longer mortgages, which are non-traditional. So I do worry that without a fair starting price, and again, let's not debate what that is here. Just, I mean, we're an ICER meeting, so there's an obvious answer to that. But without a fair starting price, there are legitimate concerns expressed by various stakeholders on policy and other areas. Is a pharma company just basically grossing it up to allow for an expected failure rate? So you really need some mechanism for coming up with a fair starting price. That said, conceptually, when one of the big questions is durability, it makes a lot of sense to try to do that through a value-based agreement to de-risk it for those ultimately paying.
So let me be devil's advocate. We've got all the other operational questions, and we will come to how you're going to decide whether this treatment has failed and you get this warranty back and what that means for patients and for other insurance issues. But the reasons that you would want to do, so here's my devil's advocate. The reasons you would want to do an outcomes-based contract is if you have real questions about the generalizability of the effects seen in the trial to the real-world population. So you've seen 98% success, but now you're going to use it in sicker patients, older patients, and it might not work as well. We're not dealing with that question here, it doesn't seem like. The other question is if you do have a durability of effect question that is in the near enough term that it makes sense to track it. I mean, if we had a durability question of between 8 to 10 years, we're probably just going to shrug our shoulders and say, we're not going to have an outcomes-based contract that's going to look at what happens 8 years from now and gives you some money back at that point. So my devil's advocate is this isn't a great example. It's a high price, but is this really a great topic for which we should be taking all the time and energy to do outcomes-based contracting when we think it's going to be generalizable, and when we have data that suggests that, well, maybe we have more longer-term data for one than the other, but we're not in the kind of 1 to 2 year durability question. We're pretty far out now on the durability questions here, 3, 4, 5, 6 at least. So my devil's advocate is to say, is this just to try to deal with a big price and to say we're doing something about it, or is this really worth the squeeze?
Yeah, Steve, I think that's well said, and I completely agree with you. This is not about just putting something out there saying we're doing something, check, done. This is quite a bit of work to operationalize, as we've talked about. So unless there's a need, let's not put it out there. Specifically, if we're at a point where we agree on the population, agree on the durability, and aren't concerned about variability, then I'd say there's no need. And say that for this or for other therapies. And again, the other issue here, which is another question, if your break even is 10 years out, maybe your price too high. But that's the past discussion. But I fundamentally would agree with what you said.
And I'm going to agree with Michael. I have to, because actually around 6 weeks ago, I was with a lot of payers, and as Steve said, I have a lot of different payers that I'm interacting with every single day, and all the payers actually stated, and it's not just hemophilia, it's sickle cell, it's every gene therapy that's going to come out, that right now that they really don't know what to do with the outcome models. They don't want them, they haven't seen them. A lot of them that proposed, you really haven't seen any information about. They'd be much more happy with them on the smaller molecule, the diabetes, the hypertension, but on these, including hemophilia, is something that they may not want to deal with, and they don't know how to deal with it. And that was a lot of payers in the United States that were stating this.
Chuck, what do you say?
Well, I mean, we've interacted with a lot of payers in the last 3 to 4 years, and not every payer is head over heels for an outcomes agreement, but a lot are. And it is because they're worried about, especially upfront variability and durability. And can you put skin in the game? The key we look at is can we operationalize? Can we get simple for the payer? I think we can. I think we can get alignment between the payer and manufacturer, and we can make this work. And if we can, I think outcomes-based agreements will be looked at differently in a couple of years than they are now. I get the skepticism now, but for us, we'll take that skepticism and see if we can't make this work. Because I think if we do, I think it's better for the patient. I think it makes it a more frictionless environment for the patient to get ultimately coverage if they want to get a gene therapy.
All right, so now let me put on my other devil's advocate hat, and that this is just more like a paranoid hat, I guess, than devil's advocate. But let's assume that patients are treated with a gene therapy and they have their first little, maybe it's a subclinical bleed, they're not sure. They wouldn't know if it's truly subclinical. Let's say they have a little bleed, then a little bit more of a bleed, and they say, wow, maybe I should go get some factor. Now the health plan suddenly is in a weird position, and maybe they don't recognize it, but they kind of want that patient, if they're going to start to bleed and need factor, they want that patient to reach whatever criteria threshold it is so that they get that warranty payment back. So they're going to want to slow walk coverage for factor and for emicizumab or whatever. Now, this is the paranoid hat on, right? But it's partly, again, back to, I forget if it was Leslie or somebody's comments, like, how are we going to frame these outcomes so that they're really clear and consistent and don't create some kind of perverse incentive by which patients are stuck not getting coverage for what they need because the health plan benefits when they fail treatment.
Steve,
I shouldn't say fail, you know what I mean? The treatment fails the patient, not the patient.
So
fails.
Steve, I would respond that we would never do anything that, opposed to what's right for the, and that's got to be your litmus test. So my tendency is to say, nope, you're paranoid. On the other hand, I'm sure there are payers out there that would do that have done similar things. So I'm going to withhold that immediate reaction, but I would like to think that the majority wouldn't do anything that crazy.
So Chuck, how do you avoid the adverse selection creating a perverse incentive here?
I mean, we hope that to Michael's point, that perverse selection doesn't exist, but there is how you also design the agreement. And one, you have a great surrogate marker that, you go below a certain level of factor VIII, that also is part of what triggers your, the failure. So that's pretty darn objective.
Okay, so, and I know we're not going to ask you to describe the specifics of what you've got, at least in draft form, even around the outcomes. But what you're suggesting is that it wouldn't just be bleeds, it could be something or bleeds or a factor level. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, integrated. It's an integrated approach of, and you need, and bleeds is part of it. It's very measurable. Factor level is part of it. And, to be honest, so is return to prophy. So all those, those elements are, and they're very measurable. And that's why we believe we can operationalize it, and also hopefully do it in such a way where you don't negatively impact patient care. That's certainly not our intent.
Okay, I'm going to run the line of hands, and then I'm going to pause and ask you guys to have a concluding statement. For those of you who've done ICER meetings before, you know what I mean, so you can start to think about it now. But let's run the hands and see where we end up. Debbie?
Yeah, so I'd like to add that at CSL, we're also considering value-based agreements. So we're in similar types of discussions. I think that a single on-demand dose of factor is going to be necessary and available to patients that have received gene therapy. It is not a completely curative treatment, and people bleed. We all bleed, but those with hemophilia that have lower factor, even though it keeps them from prophylaxis, they may need an on-demand dose. But return to prophy is clearly something that we would consider the progression to failure from gene therapy or not having any expression of the factor after the treatment, right? That's a definitive upfront failure. So those two components are areas that, we're thinking about also from that perspective.
Okay, great. Thank you. Brian?
I think return to prophylaxis could be allowed for in an outcome-based or multi-year agreement, but the decision as to whether or not an individual returns to prophylaxis after gene therapy must be a decision for the patient and the clinician to make together. You don't want somebody bleeding away to prophylaxis, but you also don't want them bleeding away to a rebate. And I think in my mind, return to prophylaxis is not the only outcome you could look at. It's probably not even the best outcome. In my view, personally, the best two outcomes are factor expression and the cost offset in terms of decreased use of CFC or emicizumab. They're easy to measure, easy to monitor, easy to adjudicate. And I think if a factor expression level is the key outcome of gene therapy.
Okay, thank you. Mark?
So I agree with Brian's comment. I think there's a few unique things about hemophilia in general, is that there are really two access decisions. And I appreciate the comments about sort of de-risking and trying to hold the health plans harmless, but the same comes to the patients as well. And I think that, is perhaps growing in interest is I have access challenges on the front end, and I should not have those same access challenges on the back end, that if I'm bleeding, that I should not end up worse off than I started. So if I would move from factor prophylaxis to gene therapy and back, or ME to gene therapy and back, I don't want to be left in a holding pattern where I have a factor expression lower than what I had when I was on the prophylaxis level and I can't get it approved. So there really needs to be absolute clarity on the front end. I agree with Brian that the factor activity level is our preferred metric. The other thing that that is very difficult to collect in a quantified way, is how patients are changing their life over the course of time. And maybe this is my closing comment. And I can sit on the couch and not bleed and not use any factor. And if that's the life that I choose, it's fine. But if I want to live a life like everyone else, I might require factor. And you can get to a zero bleed two different ways. And so the goal really is to make sure that it's reflective of what's in the patient's interest. And we keep in mind de-risking for the patients as well as the health plans. Great.
Michael, and then I have one quick question before you guys make your final comments. Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah. So another thing that the pharma companies could do to support everyone doing the right thing, to your earlier concern. And again, this is in the theme of what I mentioned before, the idea of solutions. Throw in all the factor that's needed for a period of time. Make it an all-you-can-eat affair, so that question doesn't come up for a payer.
That's an interesting idea. All right, I'm writing that down. I wanted to ask a quick question of Michael, actually, and Leslie, because I don't know if you heard the earlier discussion when the CTAF panel was voting on value. And we talked about the fact that in today's real world, let's assume these treatments are cost saving because of the very expensive factor that they would replace. Another way that ICER did the cost effectiveness was to basically say that we're not going to give you all of those cost offsets in the price, one-time price. We're going to share that in some way with the health system. And one way to do that is to cap the cost offsets that you can claim as part of that value-based price. You might have even seen the vote that they took, but as payers, what do you think a fair price represents here? Do you think more about the quote unquote real world of what I'm going to save next year, cost offsets, or do you think that I could save money, but the price is still too high?
Yeah, I'm conflicted here, and I did hear the tail end of that. And the reality is that I work in an organization where I have to make decisions that impact financials. So kind of the academic side of my brain is a purist and believes that the right way to do it is to cap it at 150,000 and not justify a high price based on drugs that are priced far higher than they should be. So that's my philosophical answer. My pragmatic answer, which is the one that I think defines how we actually operate, unfortunately is, because it's the way our financials work, is about the actual cost offsets. So if you have something that is based on prices that are way too high, I mean, we came up with this with Zolgensma and Spinraza, and you're going to see break even at a point that's the world I occupy.
All right, thanks. Leslie, any comment?
Yeah, I don't have too much to add because I started the day, I did listen to everybody the whole day with you guys. And I looked at that conversation at the beginning, which I was thinking about. And then I think Rita was the first one to mention. And later on in the day, Robert was the first one. Are we doing this relative to other therapies or relative to what the actual cost should be? And I think that we still don't know. So that's number one. And the second thing about this is that it's really hard. Yes, let me back up. All health insurers, it'd be nice if hemophilia was one of 10 diseases that they're looking at with these costs, but they're not. They're one of hundreds. And you already mentioned all those genes I have on our website at IPD. I have every single gene in the next 5 years that could be approved, and it's still hundreds. It's not even going to the next 10 years. These are extremely expensive. We can talk about, even in your area, we can talk about sickle cell disease. We can talk about so many rare diseases. And unfortunately, when we're all talking about hemophilia here, it sounds well and good, but Michael and all of the health plans that are talking to me, they're talking about every single one. You're competing for the same monies. And we actually can't afford it in the United States. Something has to be done. So that's why we're talking about management. If this was $1 million a year or less, I don't even know if you would have had these meetings. So.
Gee, $1 million doesn't get you what it used to, huh?
You know what? I can't believe I'm old enough that I can't believe that I'm saying that. Okay. So just to let you know, I remember when $6,000 was expensive.
All right. Thank you. I'm still a little bit over time, but I want to offer you guys a chance to have a final statement. What we like to ask is if you can try to just keep it to one sentence with a strategic placement of a comma or even a semicolon but really kind of focus on one message that you'd like to leave ringing in the ears of CTAF and of ICER and the people listening on this call. Sometimes, though, I also encourage you to think of a request. If you could think of one thing that you would ask one of the stakeholders at the table here, for instance, to do something different or more that would make the world a better place in 5 to 10 years, in whatever way you think better means, what would that request look like? So feel free to think of that as your final statement. It doesn't have to be just another kind of nail that you've hit before. I'm going to start with the manufacturers and we'll wrap up with the patients. They'll get the last word. But Debbie, do you mind if I ask you to go first?
Sure. So I would like to thank ICER for the opportunity to participate in today's meeting. It was very helpful for me personally, and I'm sure for my organization. We do look forward to bringing gene therapy for patients with hemophilia B in the near future. And we hope that you acknowledge the innovation and the transformational changes that we're going to be able to contribute to for this particular disease state. So thank you.
Thank you, Debbie, and thanks for participating very much. Chuck?
Yeah, I have to thank ICER and everybody as well. It's a lot of learnings for me today. And I will say, as a company bringing innovation to the marketplace, we're proud of that fact. But I would say that the voices, especially of Brian and Mark, continue to be loud because I think that drives, innovation with responsibility, and that's important.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Leslie?
Mine's easy, as you've all heard, start small. If this is a really good drug, if it's going to do well, if all the unknowns and risks don't play out that we're worried about, it will get bigger. Same thing happened with emicizumab.
Okay, thank you. Michael?
Yes, given that, as you've heard, there are so many other high-cost therapeutics on the horizon that also need to be covered by what we pretend is an unlimited budget, but it really isn't. Be thoughtful in introducing your products. Don't be reasonable, be able to demonstrate the value. And even though you may have the first product in a category, don't assume that if it is only a game in town, that the payers will cover it blindly, regardless of the cost and value proposition.
Okay, thank you very much. Who am I going to next? Clinical experts. Miguel?
Yeah, I think that this is just probably the start of the beginning of a new therapeutic era for hemophilia. And my plea is, please let's work together between the clinicians, the payers, the pharmaceutical companies, because again, this is a long way we're going to go, and this is the only way to do it.
All right, thank you. Maggie? Oops, sorry, you're muted. You get your sentence over, don't worry.
Well, I'm going to do a short poem. Hey, can't you see? They just want to be free. Free of factor infusion, free of fear and exclusion, free of bleeds and contusion, to live life without illusion. They just want to be free. So what is the confusion? Is life versus cost the collusion? But how can cost of infusion make life quality an exclusion? How is rejection by insurers a solution? Is life without fear a delusion? They just want to be free. But Valrex and Etranadaz set them free, free of IV infusion, of fear and exclusion, of bleed and contusion, of living in illusion. This is the free they want to be.
All right, that's not one sentence, but I'm going to encourage everybody else in the future to create a poem as part of their final thing. That was very good. Although when you started with free, I thought you were going to say that you were going to ask for the drug to be free until it proves its benefits.
That is the corollary.
All right, thank you so much. To our patients, Brian.
Well, I want to reassure the payers on the call that the clinicians and patients are not going to rush blindly into this just because it's a new therapy. It's going to be a very thoughtful process because this is an irreversible one-off decision for each individual patient. And I finally I want to comment on the process. I want to thank ICER because I think this process has been inclusive, it's been participatory, it's been transparent. You have sought the views of the patient organizations and the patients at an early stage and took those on board. And one example would be your agreement to add a fixed utility gain using EQ5D to measure some of the intangible benefits. So great process, and frankly, much more transparent than any HTA process I've seen in Europe.
Brian, do you have any extra sentences you would like to add on to that one for your final statement? Thank you. Thank you. You know how much we respect and appreciate the level of your guys' participation in everything we've done. So thank you. I appreciate it. Mark.
It's hard to be at the end. Echoing everything and certainly my thanks. We've been on a journey. This is our third review with ICER, and ICER, has progressively listened, and we were very pleased that more of the patient important outcomes kind of made it into the final model. So for that, we say thank you. But as noted by Miguel, we're still on a journey. There's a ways to go. My sentence was really the financial toxicity to the health system is well established. It's well known. It affects the patients and families, and we fully agree with that. As a patient, I shouldn't have to be asked to justify or apologize for the cost of my disease. I should expect and be able to hope that the treatment for my disease will remain between me and my clinician. And so we're sensitive to the barriers. While we appreciate the opportunity and the hope that these transformative therapies are bringing, there also is a level of anxiety. So all we would ask is please stay focused on the patient. Please think broadly about the outcomes of importance. ICER is on that journey with us, and we want the payers to be there as well.
All right. Thank you so much to all of you. And again, for some of you, it goes back all the way to that 8 months ago and even beyond when we've been working together to learn from you. And your comments and your input influence not just the model, not just the text of our report, but the themes and the learnings that I think CTAF and the people listening in and very broadly, I think, are learning about this area. So thank you very, very much for all your participation. And with that, I'd like to hand it back over to the chair of the CTAF, who can lead the CTAF members themselves. I don't know if any of you guys have any poetry that can match up with Maggie's, but we'll let you guys take it into the home stretch.
Thank you, Steve. So I think we're going to go through each CTAF member for a closing comment. I will start, and this is just an anecdote, not regarding the economic model, but just to reflect on one of my former patients who had hemophilia, HIV, hepatitis C, then cirrhosis, and then died of liver cancer. This was maybe 8 or 9 years ago. And I just, he has been in my mind this whole, through this whole conversation, thinking about how he did not live to see direct acting antivirals for hepatitis C, and how he was in, I didn't mention he was in chronic pain from his joint bleeds. It was just horrible. And the life that he had was just so sad. And so I just think about how far we've come with both of those therapies, and how I'm sad that he missed it. So I was just wanted to add that in as an anecdote. I guess I will call on people unless anyone wants to raise their hand to go first. Jeff, Clinton?
Yeah.
Should
I think
go?
it'll be quicker. Yeah, it's just quicker if you run the list there. I think that'll be quicker.
Okay, I will run the list.
So yes, thank you. Thanks to the patients, you guys are very sophisticated in your view of this, which we don't see in all patient groups. I really do appreciate the thoughtfulness around, that this isn't necessarily for everybody because it's the new shiny thing. That's a little unique for us, so that's kind of nice to hear. This is a very exciting time. I'm a neurologist, and so we have now things we've never been able to treat before, most of which are extremely expensive. So I get the whole, balance it. But it's pretty exciting. I mean, here we are talking about gene therapy for things that, really had been untreatable, or the treatment was very burdensome, like with hemophilia. But I would sort of, put something out to the manufacturers that, pricing is a decision. And I think I would really make a plea for some responsibility in choosing those prices, because we are, in fact, treating more things and we can't afford for everything. And there are some, ICER comes up with some guidelines that, make some real world sense. And I would just make a plea to pay attention to that. I think it's an exciting time, but I think there's big risks out there given the costs. And that's what I have to say. Unfortunately, I couldn't come up with a haiku in time.
Tony Sowery.
I agree that we seem to be on the cusp of a very exciting new world for treating haemophilia. One that will dramatically reduce cost, at least based on current real actual prices, and one that will dramatically reduce the burden on patients and increase their lifestyle choices. And it's exciting to be involved in it. Thank you.
Thank you. Anne Roldo.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would echo what so many people have already said today, which is thank you very much to the patients who joined us today. It's been amazing to hear your perspectives, and I think they're right on. I think the science that we've heard about today is extremely exciting, but of course, there's more that we need to learn. And, you know, in the meantime, and I guess not just in the meantime, but always pricing needs to be fair. And there is always a debate about what fair is, but I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Anne. Felicia Cohen.
So I've been doing this work with CTAF for a while, and it's refreshing to participate in a panel where the theme isn't patient desperation. I think this is about choices. I couldn't help but think of the old TV show, The $6 Million Man, and how that might seem reasonable given the costs we talked about today. I think this is really about choice. You know, as a bioethicist, I'm always trained to think about what is the best thing that can happen in a particular situation, and having options for treatment, as our patient advocates, our patients here have really pointed out, is miraculous. But I think they need to be real choices. So we really need to think about that pricing. So thank you.
Looking for Ralph. It's Ralph Brindisson, and I'm just not seeing
Yeah,
him.
Ralph is on. So
Oh, there. Sorry about that.
That's okay. So first, thanks ICER, thanks all the experts who came, but particularly the patient advocates, and I viewed their comments particularly superb. You know, gene therapy is an incredibly exciting advance, not just for hemophilia, but as mentioned earlier, for many other genetic diseases. Long-term concerns for efficacy, safety, including oncogenesis, really demands real-world evidence and long-term follow-up, particularly acknowledging the small number of patients enrolled in non-randomized studies with only modest or short or intermediate term follow-up that will eventually lead to FDA approval. My own experience being involved in cardiovascular and cardiovascular surgery databases, I can tell you there are huge challenges and difficulties in obtaining high-quality long-term follow-up that assesses safety and efficacy, particularly important here with gene therapy. And I would encourage active discussions involving the FDA, industry, payers, and patients, thinking about the carrots and sticks that are actually needed to promote these long-term follow-up needs, and these need to be actively pursued.
Thank you, Ralph. Kimberly?
I just actually want to acknowledge everyone who participated today, particularly the patients. As an OBGYN, I think that one voice we didn't hear today is the voice of the mom, who's the carrier and frequently the caregiver. And so I hope I'm around when we have the discussion on fetal therapy for this disease, because we do a lot of genetic counseling about it. And I think that there's some interesting opportunities.
Thank you. Sanket?
Thanks. I'll echo what everyone's saying. These are really incredible, important scientific discoveries, but they highlight the extraordinary price. And we have a drug here that doesn't even come close to conventional cost effectiveness thresholds. But we just heard in the roundtable that payers may want to cover it because of the even higher costs of the current standard of care therapies. So while there are clearly no right answers, I hope that the transparent discussion today will help to inform ongoing discussions to improve the quality of evidence, long-term follow-up for patients with hemophilia A and B, who we're grateful to have and very grateful for all of their comments here today. And more importantly as well, have greater lessons for the current drug pricing scheme in our country.
Thank you. Rita?
Thanks. I will certainly echo my thanks to ICER for this process and the transparency, and to the patients and everyone for their hard work in this topic. I will certainly echo what Sanket just said as well. When I maybe seem like a stickler for evidence, it's because, first of all, it's so hard to get good high quality evidence after drugs are out there and they're covered and we're using them. And I've been around long enough that I have seen, things that look promising turn out to be terrible disasters. And one bone marrow transplants for metastatic breast cancer, things. And if we don't, and I think this group does, we all want to do the best for patients, but I just think, and I appreciate that we look at it, that looking at quality of evidence and getting really good data, especially before regulatory approval, which does very quickly lead to coverage and widespread use and diffusion for all kinds of reasons, is so important. And certainly, especially drugs of this incredibly high cost. But for every kind of treatment, we want to make sure benefits outweigh the harms. So I'm delighted to be part of the process. Thanks.
Thanks, Rita. Bob Collier?
Sometimes hypnosis is slow. I just want to reiterate how frustrating it is having these meetings online on screen instead of in person after all these years. I want to make it clear to the world, this is gene therapy. It's not gene fixing. It's a substitute thing that goes in. It's really kind of weird how it actually behaves, in fact. I appreciate the discussion finally of an outcomes warranty, or whatever we're going to call it. At least we're getting somewhere on that nail. I counted the word fail 7 times as it applied to patients. You know how abhorrent I find that in the medical lexicon. The other thing that I really want to try and highlight here, on my little closing thing, there's been a lot of talk about the HTC, hemophilia treatment centers. Trying to find out about those things is a real pain in my butt. I've been doing it for about an hour and a half now while you all were talking, and I was paying attention to everything along the way. As a longtime participant from the very beginning with clinicaltrials.gov, let me tell you, you need to shoot the CDC search function for those things. Me trying to find out about hemophilia as treatments and treatment centers and making a judgment of the effectiveness of that from the outside is just impossible right now. I get that it's a small club and you think it's worthwhile, but I certainly hope it works out better follow-up on these things than it is for me to see it from the outside. Thanks.
All right, we have 2 CTAF members left. Paul?
Thank you. So today we had to consider a standard of care that is priced at levels I'd say are not consistent with our society's views. And while the easiest thing to do is endorse anything cheaper than that, I think in doing so, we will be encouraging unsustainable pricing that will limit the care we can provide to all patients.
Thank you, Paul. And finally, Joy.
The last word. So I always enjoy these meetings because I learn so much. And I've learned a huge amount today as a primary care physician, both about new treatments for hemophilia and also from the experts and the patients about how this all might work out in practice. And it's very exciting to see how these new technologies are starting to actually be applied in the real world. On the other hand, I've been around long enough, similar to Rita, to see exciting, shiny new things not work out as planned. And the sparse evidence here, and it does seem sparse to me, really makes me pause and feel nervous about what I think will be, immediate move forward into adopting these therapies. And I very much appreciate the patient advocates' thoughtfulness about it, given the prior experience with other treatments for hemophilia. So that's one aspect of it, is that balance between the exciting new technologies and the potential for things we don't know about yet. And then the other part of it is just yet again being reminded of how terribly dysfunctional our whole way that we deliver healthcare in this country is. It's just not sustainable to just keep adding more and more treatments at higher and higher prices and figure that somehow it's all going to work out for people. It won't. And we need a better way to establish pricing. And I know that that seems unlikely given our current political situation, but we really need to get there. So thank you all.
So Rena, I guess I can take it now because you've already had a chance, right? Okay, so a last chance for me to thank you, as well as our Policy Roundtable folks. I appreciate your comments and the thoughtfulness that you guys put into your review of the report and for the public deliberation. From my own perspective, just a couple comments about, I mentioned the excitement and the innovation and the celebration, and that's all real. And I do still think about, I don't know those individuals, the pictures of which I showed you earlier in the day, the people who are struggling with medical debt. But I think about patients I knew in the past who used to ask me in a whisper whether I had anything cheaper that I could prescribe them. Or, do I have to get this test or this procedure? And I sometimes knew that they were embarrassed to tell me that they couldn't afford it and they were trying to figure out some way around it. And I hear stories all the time now from small employers who are saying that I'm going to have to, if I'm going to provide health insurance, I'm going to have to say no cell or gene therapy at all because I'm too small. I can't, even one person who pops up and needs a $4 million or $2 million or $3 million treatment and I'm dead. So we have a real dysfunction in our insurance system to a certain extent around these one-time big prices. And I know that the drug companies are working on that, but whether it's 2, 3, 4 million as they accumulate, we are really headed towards a dark place. Despite all the innovation, despite all the wonderful things that it can bring to patients and families. And I guess, it could end up being a federal government carve out where we just say that, insurance on the private model is not going to work for these kinds of things. And actually, hemophilia is a good example because what I've heard the most is that when you can predict ahead of time which patients are going to get these gene therapies in an employer base, that's where often, a reinsurer or other people will say, no, we're not going to cover gene therapy for hemophilia because you've got hemophilia patients in your employment contract. So it's not like it's brand new cases kind of springing up. You can actually track and know where these people are. And that creates a financial kind of perverse incentive for coverage. So we have all these problems. And as far as the pricing themselves, I mean, as you know, this was an extraordinary case of the price that we could have said was a fair price being based 99% on the cost offset, 1% on the health benefit. The health benefit is there, but there's a huge cost offset. And somewhat to like what Paul said, one way I think that we need to shift in our general thinking about pricing is that if there is the opportunity to save money by effectively helping patients, we shouldn't give all of those cost savings to, if you will, to the drug maker in the form of a higher price, because we all need some cost to come out of our healthcare system somewhere to create headroom for further innovation. And so one way to do that is to share those savings in a principled, regular way and not just load them into a high price that puts us on escalator towards higher prices and worse affordability. So there will be controversies around how to do this because it's not a very standard approach in cost effectiveness, but I'm proud, honestly, of the ICER team for having recognized this. And we were talking about it 2 or 3 years ago, but I think it's healthy for us to have it come into play in our discussions today, because it will be an ongoing part of the health policy discussion around how we can both incentivize future innovation, but do it in a way that can make it affordable to everybody. So thank you very much again. Love the policy roundtable. I look forward to producing our final report. I think we usually have one final slide that suggests that it will be coming out in a couple of weeks. If people want to put up that slide. So, yep. So just in time for your Christmas stocking or Hanukkah table, you will be able to have this final report, and it will reflect our best job at trying to capture the richness of the discussion as well as the voting and other aspects of today. Thanks very much to all of you who've been watching online. Like Bob, I hope we can get back to in-person meetings soon. But in the meantime, I hope you are all well, and we look forward to seeing the CTAF at our next meeting. Take care, everybody.
Thanks. Bye-bye.